hopefully I'll explain it in such a way that it'll be helpful to you once you actually have it in your hands. So, so are we ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Okay. First, I want to just a quick introduction. I'm Vicki Pelletier. All three of us are from the New Lenox team of the ICPN SST. I'm Vicki.
I'm Kelly.
And I'm Mary.
Nice to, we wish to see you all. Before we get started, I have a couple of just logistical things and then a long disclaimer. You guys, your audio is off, your video is off, so you don't need to worry about any of that. If you do have questions or want to make comments, Mary is going to be monitoring the chat box. So probably the best thing to do is put it in there. If you want everyone to see it, make sure everyone sees it. If you want to just send it to Mary, select her from the list. We are going to be doing a couple of breaks. I think we've learned over time an hour is long enough for people to sit and pay attention without having a couple minutes. So Mary's going to track that for us, and we'll give you a couple of breaks, and we're going to do our best to get it under 3 hours. It took us 3 hours last time, but we're hoping that we can streamline it a little bit for you. So, and now the disclaimer. This is definitely a COVID presentation that you are going to get. Kelly is home with 6 kids. I am at home and have new kittens who are not counter and table trained. So we apologize in advance for any pounding from kids or crying or cats that may happen to come across your screen or your audio in advance. My internet connection is now unstable, it's telling me, and mine is usually excellent, as is Kelly's, and she's having trouble today too. And to add to the fun, all of the embedded videos are not automatically going to YouTube. So Kelly is going to have to do some jockeying back and forth. So please be forgiving and patient with us as we get through this to the best of our ability. But now the disclaimer. We did not, when we first were asked to do this training, we were asked to do it for the ICPN and then extend it to the community for the purpose of basically helping people to know these conditions when they see them. So it is not intended to be a thorough training on each of the 7 conditions that we're going to be talking about, but rather an overview of the similarities and then the unique features of that disorder or syndrome that may allow you to differentially diagnose it, particularly against autism. There's increasing information out there now to suggest a lot of folks are being misdiagnosed with autism who in fact may be struggling with genetic and other kinds of disorders, or we may be lumping some of their comorbid conditions in and explaining them as part of their autism when in fact they warrant separate diagnosis and treatment. So our goal was not to help you understand every aspect of Cornelia de Lange syndrome, but we've provided you with a whole bunch of links and resources so that you can get very specific information with regard to each of these conditions if you're serving someone and you want to make sure you're doing everything that you can for them. So we'll do our best. Each person, I think, listening and hearing is probably focusing on what's most important to them. We are reporting to you what we felt was most important to us or what we felt distinguished it the most in terms of our perspective. You may see things a little bit differently. We are also going to be talking about the conditions. The order is in terms of prevalence, but also we are going to be talking about symptomatology or behavioral presentations that are typical of individuals diagnosed with that disorder, but not everybody diagnosed with that disorder will exhibit those symptoms. So like any other syndrome or disorder, there's a great deal of variability within individuals who share that diagnosis. So there are some symptoms we're going to talk about that occur typically in children, but not in adults, and the reverse. And some in full mutations and only pre-mutations, and we're not going to get into all the genetic stuff for you. So again, our intent is to give you a little bit of an overview. And then I just wanted to note, for purposes of like the research part of it, as well as where we got our information, we tended to use primarily the government's resources. So the National Institutes of Health, there's a National Organization of Rare Diseases, all of which can provide a wealth of information. There are also a lot of strong advocacy sites that are on behalf of individuals who are diagnosed with each of these conditions. And I'm going to touch on the treatment recommendations that they make, but there are many advocacy organizations that are very, very focused on research, and they are funding a lot of the early work to kind of dabble in the water, see if a variable may be relevant before the government and other entities are willing to fund that research. It has to have a certain volume or a certain potential to make a difference. So we restricted the review of the research to just the pieces that are being monitored and tracked through NIH, but there's a whole bunch more out there. And again, we've provided you with those links if you really want to dive deeply into any aspect of one of the conditions about which we're going to speak. So, okay, I'm going to hope that everybody has this document in front of them who's going to be able to have it in front of them. So Kelly, will you put this one up on the,
Sure.
On this, share this? We see you.
I have to stop my share screen.
Yeah, this is the funny thing you have to apologize for, guys. So this table, and this is something that you have or will have with you, is a comparison between autism spectrum disorder and the 6 different genetic syndromes across a range of different things. So they're physical features, facial features, medical issues, behavioral issues, a little bit on treatment, comorbid conditions. And can you go up, Kelly?
Sure.
Just for purposes of explanation, if the
Yep.
buckets are grayed out, it is that there were not a significant number of folks identified as exhibiting that particular feature or issue that's being identified. For the yellow highlights, those are characteristics or behavioral presentation or whatever the category is that are unique to that particular condition or syndrome. And so those should be most helpful to you in terms of differentially diagnosing one from another. You will see, we're going to show you a series of videos through this training. And any one aspect of it, it is difficult, with the exception of maybe Cornelia DeLange, where there are some very distinct physical features, to distinguish between the behavioral presentation. You'll see, will you go down a little bit, Kelly, to like medical? If you look at, for example, sleep, autism spectrum disorder, and every single one of the genetic disorders that we're reviewing, people tend to have issues, whether it's just disturbed sleep or reversed circadian rhythm, as you see in Smith-Magenis. So, and it's true also in a number of the medical areas. A significant number of them have seizure involvement. A surprising number have issues with muscle tone, primarily looser muscle tone, but there's a couple where you see much more tensing. So there are many, many features in common. So we're going to try to highlight for you the ones in yellow and make sure that we're identifying for you. If you see this, you may want to consider having the person evaluated, because although many of the treatments are similar, there are some really important differences, particularly in some of the ABA treatment and interventions in terms of individuals with different syndromes. So that's just a little bit of a brief explanation. If you have questions, again, put them in the chat box, and we will be working from left to right as we compare each of these conditions against autism. And then the only other thing, do you want to address to sclerosis before, or you want to wait till we get to it, Kelly?
I think we should get to it.
Okay. And Kelly's going to get started with autism.
Okay. So as Vicky said, we're kind of going to go through each of the disorders and kind of define the disorder itself in order of prevalence. And then we're going to always go back and compare and contrast with autism spectrum disorder. And I think to start, we're really going to, I know everybody works with someone with ASD, but so we're all on the same page and we all have that same foundational knowledge. So you can really recognize what's autism versus some of these other intricacies that you'll see in some of the disorders we're going to be talking about. So we will spend a bit of time right here at the beginning talking about autism. And then we might have some case examples if applicable throughout. And then we'll also cover the treatment options and research and resources and have some things for you guys to use. So autism disorder is qualified as a developmental disability. And we know it causes differences in the brain, right? So there's still a lot that's unknown, but there's very much a lot that is known. And there are two variances of genetic components to autism, which we'll cover here in a bit. There's often nothing about how people with autism spectrum disorder look to differentiate them between neurotypical population. But within these two subsets, there are some characteristics and features that you can use that's kind of right on the cusp of all this research. So it's very interesting, but typically you can't really see if someone has autism, but they do behave, communicate, interact, and learn in ways that are different from most other people. The abilities of people with autism can vary quite significantly. Some people can have advanced conversation, and we all know somebody who really has a fixation on something and can talk and talk and talk and talk about a certain topic. And they seem like they're a genius, right? And they might be in that area, but when it comes to, taking care of themselves and using those higher level functionings and activities of daily living, that's maybe where they struggle. So I kind of want to just go through all of the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, not so much in a clinical diagnostic sense, but just to get a global picture of what someone with autism spectrum disorder may or may not be presenting with. So typically they have deficits in social communication, where there's a deficit in that social and emotional reciprocity, not having a lot of empathy or wondering about how you're doing, right? I'll answer the question that you asked me, but I'm not going to ask, oh, and how are you today? Or how was your holiday? Or something like that. It's very self-centered in that sense. Maybe they have an abnormal social approach, right? So maybe it's just a little awkward, like, well, that was weird. Or maybe they don't know what to say in social situations and they blurt something out that you and I would say is inappropriate or just not socially acceptable. Typically, there's a failure of normal back and forth flowing conversation. A lot of the time things are very rigid. Things are, they only want to talk about their interests and things that they want to do. Sometimes people with autism will seek others out, and respondents on questionnaires or whatever, if they're filling this out for autism, will say, oh yeah, well, he'll come to me and initiate things. Well, is it only if he needs something? Does he need you to open this can of pop? Or does he need you to start the shower or something like that? Or does he like pull on your sleeve or something? we wouldn't actually count that as an initiation for social communication. Reduced sharing of interests, again, the very limited number of things that an individual with autism is interested in. A lot of the times we see people who are very interested in computers and technology and can tell you X, Y, and Z about it and get me completely lost. But beyond that, they don't really have a lot of other things that they like to do. Their emotions and emotional affect may be quite different than that of someone who's neurotypical. They also will have a deficit typically in nonverbal communicative behaviors, poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication, abnormalities in eye contact, which a lot of us know, difficulties understanding the use of gestures, right? So this is a big one. If I do this, do they really know what that means? Or if I'm looking at something off in the distance and I point without saying anything, are they going to turn and look to what I'm looking at? Or are they going to be like, what is she doing? So a lot of that confusion, obviously the inability to recognize facial expressions, right? Sometimes people with ASD have used a lot of intervention and training, and they are really good at knowing that person is sad, that person is happy, but beyond that and into some of the more intricate emotions, or maybe they're able to label that person is sad, but they're not able to kind of figure out why. Okay, they're making a frowning face, that means they're sad, and then that's it, right? Where someone who's neurotypical might think, okay, what happened? What made them sad? And we might want to figure that out and speak with them about that. Someone with autism may also have a lack of facial expression themselves, right? And so you can't really read what's going on and understand them just based on their expression. Also, someone with ASD typically has deficits in developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. For example, it can range from difficulties to adjusting to behavior to suit various social contexts. I think during the holidays, I know I'm going to be with a lot of family. I need to, watch my language when I'm around my mother. But if I'm out with a group of friends, I'm not going to be talking in the same way, right? And I can use different things to express something, and someone with ASD isn't going to catch on those subtle cues. And, oh, my mom is sitting right here, maybe that would be offensive, I shouldn't say that. There's really none of that filter that's there. A lot of the times there's difficulties when they're younger, typically in imaginative play. You don't really see them engaging in that a lot, right? A lot of the times people will want to be a fireman and there's a fire and go grab the hose. And depending upon their developmental age, maybe they'll gather their friends, right? Or maybe they'll just do it by themselves. But you can see from a fairly early age if they're, really just focusing on an object and using the tool as instructed, or are they going to go grab the hose of the vacuum that mom left out for the last 2 days, not speaking from experience, and, have your kid come and run and grab the hose and put out the fire. They also typically have an absence of an interest in peers and in social relationships. That's not always the case. A lot of the times people with autism want that social interaction, want to have friends, but don't really know how to do it, don't know how to keep or maintain a friendship. Again, it's all kind of very one-sided typically. People with autism have restrictive and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. A lot of those stereotypies in repeating motor movements, use of objects or speech. So having a fixation with a toy car and just spinning the wheel of the car and watching it, right? And literally doing that for hours. lining up toys or flipping objects or taking things apart, echolalia, so repeating things back. Sometimes it makes sense to the context, right? Oh, Vicky just said autism spectrum disorder, so I'm going to say autism spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder. Or maybe I have a few rote things that are in my repertoire that I say all the time, right? Johnny was throwing apples. Johnny was throwing apples, right? And just that fixation that can come out. Maybe that's something that happened 2 years ago. Let's see. There are instances of that inflexibility, that rigidness, that need for routine and ritualized patterns, right? Before I put on my shoes, I have to, I don't even know. I have to make sure I roll my pant leg up. That's a silly example. Just, okay, it's Monday. I know Mondays I go, to day program, and then I'm going to have my lunch, and I have to pack my lunch in that blue bag. And then I'm going to sit right here in the same spot that I've always sat in for the last 12 years. And Rebecca is going to be sitting next to me. Right. And so to really have that rigidity, and if something goes wrong, if you packed your lunch in a red bag instead of your blue one, things can kind of really unravel, right? Something is wrong, something in my being, something is wrong. So it can be something very little, or it can be big changes, right? Like mom and dad aren't actually going to come see you this weekend. They have COVID, whatever that is, right? And so that change in routine or change in expectations can be very, very difficult for someone with autism spectrum disorder. One, to kind of understand and comprehend, but two, to cope with and deal with. A lot of that inflexibility, they have highly fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, right? So everybody loves a good video game, right? But I'm not going to go sit there and play it for all my waking hours, right? And I can't tell you all the characters and all that of that fantasy world. I know we're all thinking of somebody at this time. People with autism spectrum disorder also have a hyper or a hypo, so more or less reactivity to sensory input, or even an unusual interest in sensory aspects. So having a big reaction to noise or sound. Obviously, loud noise is alarming or distracting to everybody, right? But smells can be very triggering, and can kind of cause an imbalance in them. Adverse reactions to pain, temperature, tactile things, how your clothing feels. You only can use a certain towel or a certain towel brand because that's what feels best. Other things just do not like it, or certain types of food, right? Mashed potatoes are weird and gross because is it a solid? Is it a liquid? What's happening? A lot of visual fascination with lights or movement of lights, or of watching somebody walking really quickly. I do want to say that, so that's all information from the DSM-5. DSM-4, if someone that was diagnosed with autistic disorder, is what it was called, Asperger's disorder, or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, PDD-NOS, typically those people who were once diagnosed with that now fall under the autism spectrum disorder. And so now there's just a range of, obviously it's on a spectrum, range of severity of diagnoses. I have seen a few cases though where someone with a PDD-NOS doesn't qualify for ASD now, right? And maybe they'll fall into some sort of communication disorder or a sensory processing disorder. But typically those that we've seen diagnosed with DSM-4 will fall back into this autism spectrum disorder. I also want to note that people with autism spectrum disorder may or may not have an intellectual impairment. They also may or may not have an accompanying language impairment. So some people might be able to speak as fluidly as someone who's neurotypical, and it ranges to completely nonverbal. And that is not a distinguishing feature any longer of autism spectrum disorder. You can be diagnosed. I think Vicki was touching on this. So just because you have autism spectrum disorder doesn't mean you don't also have anxiety, depression, any of the genetic disorders that we're going to be talking about, right? So you can be diagnosed with both. I think a lot of the times people say, oh, well, that's just Johnny, right? That's just his autism. When really the guy is anxious about going to school, right? He gets up, maybe beginning of the school year, he would vomit before going to school. He was so anxious. And so you think, oh, he just does it. It's just not his routine, right? But really there's an intense anxiety disorder going on. And he's anxious in all situations and in talking to new people. And I can see where it could be attributed in some cases to simply his autism spectrum disorder. But there are many times that comorbid disorders actually go unnoticed or simply be attributed to autism spectrum disorder. I hope you don't all hear my child crying in the background. And I think that that's something that's doing a disservice to people, right? And so just making sure we're ruling out all those comorbidities. Could it also be autism, or could it also be anxiety disorder? And really kind of doing that differential. That I think is all I kind of wanted to cover broadly, so that we're all on the same page. We all have a good, clear idea. And again, maybe you have somebody in mind that you assist with autism spectrum disorder.
Can I ask
Yeah.
you to talk about how it's typically diagnosed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So autism is typically diagnosed through a clinical exam, right? So you would go into your psychologist, psychiatrist, and there's a variety of different ways once you're there. Some are based on self-report, right? And so you as a staff member, you as a case manager might receive a form and say, fill this out for Tom, and answer yes, no, or 1, 2, 3. And the clinician will read that, score it, and say, yes, you have autism. No, you don't. Autism does need to be evident in 2 or more situations, right? So if Tom only exhibits all of these behaviors when he's at home, but when he's at school or work or with friends, you don't see any of that, right? He's flexible in his thinking. He's able to make friends. He initiates communication, has reciprocal communication. Then Tom would not, in fact, have autism spectrum disorder. So you can either have a self-report measure, and I say self-report, but typically it's parent report, teacher report, which is.
Can I add one thing there?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a caution, right? Because again, if the diagnosis is based on individual people's reports, those are subjective. But when you hear that situation where it's occurring exclusively at home or exclusively at school, there's a strong tendency to then assume that it is behavioral in origin. But in fact, it may indicate that the person is simply not autistic, and that we need to look further in terms of our diagnosis for that person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's the subjective way to diagnose. A more objective way is to, there's a few different assessments, but the kind of the gold standard is the ADOS. the autism diagnostic something. Now put me on the spot.
Sorry.
Let's pretend. Yeah. So that is where an individual comes into the clinician, and the clinician presents the individual with various scenarios or various items, various tasks, right? And so they can monitor over however long it takes to administer this assessment, which is typically quite a few hours, how the child plays, or I say child, how the individual plays with objects or items, right? Are they using them as intended? Do they use them a little odd? Are they just standing there spinning the wheel of the car, right? And so this way you're kind of presented with the child and are able to determine there in the moment how the individual responds to stimuli, to people and relationships. And so that, again, that's kind of the gold standard is the ADOS.
Ellie, quick question. In the chat box, someone had asked, what's the earliest age someone can be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder?
That's a good question. So typically the earlier the better, right? We want early intervention. We want to recognize these things so that we can help build upon skills, and so that we're getting in there as soon as we can to work on all of these different domains. I typically it's kind of at age 2 or so. Sometimes you can see things before, maybe they're slower to develop in other areas and you kind of suspect, but usually age 2 would be the earliest that an individual could be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I've seen a lot of the times though, where somebody who was a child in the 50s or 60s, perhaps, they were diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia. And so they carry that diagnosis. And then obviously when they turn of age, then they carry the diagnosis of schizophrenia, which there are some overlapping symptoms between autism spectrum disorder and schizophrenia. And it was very prevalent in the 50s and 60s to give that diagnosis instead. But that was just doing everybody a disservice, right? And so they're treating symptoms of schizophrenia where you typically have hallucinations and delusions and psychotic features where that's not needed, right? And maybe they could have benefited from some other behavioral intervention or, not have been put on the psychotropic medication for the past 40 years, which has led to all these other side effects and issues down the road. Yeah. So
There's another question.
Yeah.
That somebody noted, I think when you were talking about struggles with social interactions, interest in playing with peers, some of that. This sounds somewhat like a narcissist. Can narcissism be confused with autism?
Interesting.
Yeah. I've never known anyone to be misdiagnosed with autism, but certainly some of the features.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think you're right. So autism is very kind of in their own bubble. And in that sense, they're very, very selfish in that way. How do I get my needs met? Which is also true of somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, right? How does it benefit me? I'm the best, but this autism spectrum disorder is much more of a developmental delay, right? And you'll see patterns in all of these other areas that we've covered, right? So the social, the repetitive kind of behaviors, all of those things. Whereas someone with narcissistic personality disorder, it's much more about, their ego, and they're able to go about and navigate as somebody with a neurotypical development, if that makes sense.
It does. But it does also make sense. I mean, there are at least in terms of viewing individuals in the world around them almost as objects or tools to
Right.
meet their needs and desires. So
Yeah,
certainly makes sense.
interesting. I've not ever really thought about those two comparatively. Thank you. So again, right on the kind of this cutting edge research, they've kind of discovered that there are these different genotypes within autism spectrum disorder, and there are two that are clearly defined. There's a CHD8. It's a gene that regulates the structure of the DNA, and people are kind of referring to it as the autism gene. And people with this this genotype all have the same kind of cluster of symptoms, characteristic features. You'll see a lot of the times medically they have constipation. They'll also have a large head, and the vast majority of people who have this gene variety will also have autism. And then there is also mutations in another gene. It's the DYRK1A gene, which is also something that people are exploring, another set of distinct features, facial features, characteristics. Here they typically have an accompanying intellectual disability. You'll see people with speech delay, motor problems, and a small head. And these, set apart other people with autism spectrum disorder. So it's not to say that somebody, with microcephaly and a motor delay has this gene variability. Again, a lot of the times people will present with an array of symptoms, but it's just something to be noted within this genotype. Okay, I need to click on this, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and share it again.
When my kid is sick, I just want the stuff that works.
Well, I don't want artificial dyes in my kid's medicine.
And
Is
everybody
Genexa
Genexa right for me?
the YouTube
Yes,
video.
shop Genexa in the kids' medicine aisle at Walmart Supercenters.
What about my little noodle bean?
Yes.
Can everybody see and hear the video?
I see some yeses in the chat.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. I just want to make sure, especially as we're getting going with some of these videos, that people are able to do so.
Nothing has changed.
Hey, Jacob. Jacob.
Okay. So there were some examples on there, excuse me, where I thought, well, yeah, but all kids do that, or, you know, especially the first few. But I think when you kind of take it as a whole and when you notice that it's becoming a pattern, right? So he only plays with those set of toys all the time, day after day after day, right? Kids kind of get in a routine where they only want to play with the kitchen, you know, for a week and then on to the next. But if they're only doing that and they're, you know, constantly pacing back and forth and it kind of becomes a routine, then you can kind of put all the pieces together and start to suspect. These are the facial features of people of those two different gene variations that I was just talking about. So you can kind of see a lot on the left, the CHD8, kind of a longer face. The DYRK1A also kind of has some distinctive facial features, but I also have to say on some of them, I wouldn't necessarily say there's something genetically going on here, right? So autism spectrum disorder in general, whether or not it's this, those distinctive genotypes, it's estimated that 31% of children with autism spectrum disorder have an IQ of 70 or below. And an IQ of 70 or below is intellectual disability. 25% have an IQ in the below average range, and 44% of individuals with autism have IQ scores in the average or above average range. And this is just something I thought was kind of weird that I just had to note, that drowning is actually a leading cause of death for children with autism, and approximately 90% of deaths associated with wandering or bolting by age 14 and younger. So I just kind of thought that was weird. Had to share. Okay, so now we're going to kind of be showing you features of the table. And as we get into each disorder, we'll kind of compound on that. So this is just autism spectrum disorder. So
Ellie, just a heads up, we
Mhm.
are nearing an hour into the presentation. If you wanted to take a break before you go into the characteristics, and then I can go back to a couple of the comments in the chat box before the break. Someone has said that they are now supporting someone who looks as if they presents with some characteristics of ASD, but because he wasn't diagnosed earlier on, he's now in his 30s, no one will evaluate him.
And okay, so let's address the first thing. Personally, Vicky, I think we should kind of get through just all of the autism and then kind of take a break and then come back and talk about each of the disorders, if that's okay.
And I agree. And I think actually you did a really nice job of talking about the behavioral presentation. And there really aren't, other than the physical features you identified, there aren't any medical issues that are unique to autism. So we can almost jump through
Skip, yeah.
sections.
Yeah.
Just to a couple notes about, sensitivities and treatment. And the research is a very short video, which I think will address a couple of the questions actually that I saw too. But Mary,
Okay.
do you want to do those now, Kelly, or do you want to do them after the?
Well, the one question before I forget about, someone in their 30s has a lot of these same features. A lot of the time it's very difficult to have them qualify for services through ASD if they weren't, if they weren't diagnosed before the age of whatever it is that Illinois states.
It has to be under 18, so
18.
you'd be able to go back and find evidence.
Right. So I was in Nebraska and it actually had to be diagnosed before 17.
Oh.
They would make exceptions where if you could find historical records, either medical records or school records where you could gather enough kind of subjective data. If you had test scores from before, things like that, they could sometimes incorporate that, but it is difficult to do sometimes. I agree. Also interesting to note, ASD is 4.3 times more likely to be diagnosed in males. And again, those physical features, like we said, are really only distinctive within those two gene variants, if at all. Vicky, if you wanted to touch on any of that, or if you want me to go through.
I think this is that none of these are unique, right? They all can occur with folks with autism. So I don't feel like we need to discuss them in any depth.
Okay.
And then I think you already talked about a majority of the behavioral presentation, right? That we make highly fluent all the way to people who have severe communication deficits. But I think one thing that I did want to, it's fine, go ahead, let your slide.
Okay.
I think again, most people are, oops, where are you going, Kelly?
I don't know.
You're back. Oh, okay. You're going around, honey. I don't think you mean to be. Okay. Can you go forward one slide? Okay. Most people are familiar with the hypersensitivity. I think it is important. So we went through a lot of the different behavioral presentations, but I think it's really important to, as you are trying to determine if someone has autism, as I talked about at the very beginning, there's increasing research and increasing anecdotal information to suggest people are misdiagnosing people with autism as a result of the presence of co-occurring comorbid conditions that are being assigned to the autism. So, and again, I'm not going to belabor this point too much. We have a video from Autism Speaks kind of summarizing the research outcomes for the last 10 years. But I really want to encourage you, if you are serving individuals who are struggling with anxiety, OCD is the one that I constantly hear people attributing to autism. I would ask that you check the diagnostic features because rarely is the individual actually exhibiting the diagnostic features of OCD. But if they are, you need to get them the treatment and the help that they need. If in fact an individual has a comorbid anxiety disorder. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into some of the other syndromes. Some of, for example, the gold standard of treatment for autism, right, I think has been demonstrated over the years is ABA therapy. We do early intervention. We do all kinds of behavior analysis. If an individual is hypersensitive to the environment, they become overwhelmed, but it is related to their anxiety disorder, the best thing we can do to help that person is to reduce the amount of stimulation. And the way we would treat it, typically, if they're trying to escape a situation that they need to be in, would be to do escape extinction through ABA, which if they have an anxiety disorder, is just going to further exacerbate their anxiety disorder. And I apologize if I made that too complicated, but it's so important that this is not just an academic exercise. That's part of why I think we agreed to do it. In general, the treatments are similar, but if in fact someone has a different disorder, we can actually be doing harm instead of good by treating it as autism. And none of us come to work for that. But I think these are in some ways in order of prevalence that we see, right? So I think most people are serving someone with autism, see signs of some anxiety, see some at least behavior that they would describe as OCD-like, ADHD. And again, Kelly, you already talked about that whether there's a comorbid intellectual disability or not is hit or miss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you go to the next? Oh, I'm so sorry. Allergies. Okay. The treatment recommendations for autism, there is no known cure. And in fact, as we go through each of these different syndromes, many of the recommendations are the same: treating the symptoms, ensuring that you are treating any medical issues that may be associated with it, physical and occupational therapy as appropriate or needed, medication, ABA. Obviously, I think the evidence-based practices with regard to early intervention are pretty well established. And then social skills training is identified specifically. They're actually, that is all through NIH, through the governmental. I think, Kelly, you actually have slides of this. There's a vast amount of research out there on autism, and there's actually a clearinghouse on evidence-based practices where they put out 28 different evidence-based practices based on a review of thousands of articles. And generally, you can see that they are typically behavioral interventions of one sort or another, right? Using extinction, using antecedent interventions, functional communication training, differential reinforcement. And I'd be happy to, you have this link, but I'd be happy to provide you with the actual report if anybody is interested. And Mary, maybe you should put our email addresses in. Did you put them in the end of the PowerPoint, Kelly?
I did not know.
Well, you put them in the chat, Mary, because there are various things we'll present that if people would like individual copies separate, we'd be happy to provide them. We also have a number of assessments and things too. So the research piece, again, I'm not going to belabor it very much. There's obviously, given the prevalence of autism, there is a huge, huge, huge amount of research that is out there, both governmentally funded as well as privately funded through Autism Speaks and a number of other organizations. For example, there are 1,200. I did this count, I believe in June. Did I do it or July, Kelly?
Yeah,
close enough. Within the last 6 months or so, 1,200 studies just on NIH. And then there are hundreds and hundreds more that are being funded by private organizations. Whereas when we get to like Cordelia DeLay, I think it's 7, so it really reflects probably the marketing of the advocacy organizations more than anything else. But rather than my going through all the details, we've provided them to you. And we have a brief video where I believe the chairperson of Autism Speaks is summarizing what he sees as what they have found as the 4 or 5 major things that have come out of the last decade of research and related to questions that were asked.
Over the last decade, Autism Speaks Science has led to major breakthroughs that are already allowing us to better understand and help people with autism. Here are 4 of those breakthroughs. The first breakthrough is early identification and diagnosis. Autism Speaks Science funded the Baby Siblings Research Consortium. This group of researchers studied the younger siblings of children with autism. These siblings allowed us to understand the early signs and symptoms and to get clinicians that information so that they could decrease the age of diagnosis. About a decade ago, most children with autism were diagnosed around age 4, 5, or even older than 6. We now know that the national average of diagnosis for autism is less than age 4. And we also know that many children can be identified by age 2. The second major breakthrough is timely intervention. Autism Speaks funded research has shown that early developmental and behavioral interventions make a big difference. Investigators such as Jerry Dawson and Jonathan Green have demonstrated that direct child intervention and parent training make lasting differences by improving a child's ability, decreasing the challenges they experience, and improving their daily living skills. The third breakthrough is understanding and treating the associated medical and mental health conditions that go along with autism. We now know that autism goes along with a number of medical and mental health challenges, including sleep difficulties, seizures, feeding difficulties, ADHD and anxiety symptoms. These additional challenges were once thought to just be part of autism. We now know that they need a separate evaluation, diagnosis, and appropriate treatment. The Autism Speaks funded Autism Treatment Network has made a major difference by educating clinicians, physicians, psychologists, speech-language pathologists about these co-occurring medical and mental health conditions. Physicians and other clinicians need to understand that these co-occurring medical and mental health conditions are not simply part of autism. They need to be able to look at these conditions separately and to be able to provide appropriate evaluation and treatment. The fourth major breakthrough is a massive increase in our understanding of the biology of autism. We now know that there are approximately 100 genes associated with autism. We're also starting to understand the biological functions and pathways that lead to autism. It's these discoveries that are going to allow us to develop new personalized therapeutics and medicines that can make a big difference in the lives of individuals with autism. Autism Speaks funded research projects such as the Autism Genetic Resource Exchange and the Missing Project, whole genome sequencing, are allowing us to understand not only the genes involved, but to uncover that biology. Understanding each person's unique biology will allow us to develop care strategies that are not based upon group averages, but rather based on each person's unique biological profile. These research breakthroughs would not have been possible without the support of so many people around the country and around the world. It's thanks to you that Autism Speaks Science is making a difference every.
There we go. Okay, it's 2:05 according to my phone. We'll give you 10 minutes. We're going to
Peace of mind is a big relief.
much
Manage
more quickly.
seasonal symptoms or worried you.
So we just wanted to make sure we had a good understanding of autism to be the jumping off point. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Kelly, are we going to have for these next, you, physical, medical, me, behavioral?
Yes, I jumped in and said, and I was like, oh, wait, no, that's not her.
No, it's fine. It's absolutely fine the way you did it. I mean, we
Okay.
talked about, right, being much more extensive on that one. Just needed to know if I was going to do both. Okay.
Nope, I've got it. Sorry about
what
that.
we're called. So no apology necessary. I'll be right back. Hi. I'm just doing the training, but we're taking a break. Which, read well, she should. She should have it. Hang on one second. I didn't mute myself when I walked away to talk to you. Hold on. Thank you, Mary Turner, or Mary Thomas. Okay, it's 2:15, so we're going to get started again. And I'm going to have to apologize in advance. I may have to step away. My 94-year-old mother is doing her first virtual doctor's appointment with her caregiver without me, and they're having some IT issues. So I think I helped them, but I might have to help them a little more. So, but Mary, are there other things in the chat or questions we should address about autism? We talked about narcissism.
There were none.
Okay, so we don't need to do it if not relevant. Okay. Kelly, you want to move on to Fragile X?
Let's do it. If I can find. Okay. Okay, so Fragile X will be the first and most prominent, most prevalent of the disorders that we're going to kind of cover and then compare and contrast with autism spectrum disorder. Again, Fragile X is a genetic condition. It has typically a range of developmental problems, disabilities, learning disabilities, cognitive impairment, intellectual disability, and typically males are more affected by this disorder than females in terms of their symptomology and in terms of ability. So most males and about half of females with Fragile X have characteristic features physically that you can see. They become more distinctive and apparent with age. You can tell that they have a long, narrow face, larger, more prominent ears, a larger jaw, larger forehead. Strangely, they have very flexible fingers. Typically, they have flatter feet, and they have enlarged testicles in males after puberty is common. So don't worry, I don't have these graphics for all of them. But I thought this one was interesting because it is sex-linked characteristics. So we all know the X and the Y gene, which is why males are more affected. They have an X and a Y chromosome. So if their X is impaired in any way, they're going to display those features. Whereas females have two X chromosomes and can sometimes kind of make up for any abnormalities in the other X chromosome that they carry.
And unlike some of the other disorders, Fragile X is linked specifically to that protein being missing. It's very, very specific.
Correct. When I do this again, bear with me. Stop sharing. Share.
And I want to challenge folks as you're watching these to really, if we didn't tell you what disorder was being presented, would you identify what the individual's doing as autistic-like or something else?
At all. Both of them didn't crawl till they were 11 months old. They didn't walk till they were 17 months old. And doctors on the first one just kept telling me, it's a boy, he's slow, don't worry, and he was a big boy. But then language never came, and that was the hard part. And there were signs that we didn't know in the beginning, like anxiety. I remember my 3-year-old holding him, and the baby would be asleep, and someone would knock at the door, just a neighbor stopping by to say hi, and it was unexpected, and I would hold my 3-year-old, and when I would open the door, he'd throw up all over me out of anxiety. Every time. We'd go to a restaurant, and when the waitress would come to take our order, he'd throw up. In traffic, if they were in their car seats behind us in the car, if it got really bad, they'd both start throwing up and screaming and crying, and we had no idea why that was happening. At 6, he started putting words together. At 5, he started having words. And I remember I asked a speech pathologist, I took him to speech therapy 3 to 4 times a week. And I asked them, do you think he'll ever talk? And they said they weren't sure. And that was really scary for us. The key we found to get language from him is we did occupational therapy first for an hour and then speech, because with the occupational therapy, it got everything going and he was centered and he was able to then work on speech. And in kindergarten, one of his first words to his kindergarten teacher, he was having a rough time, and this is a great thing. He told her, "Shut up, penis." And I remember her calling me and telling me this, and I was mortified. I thought I was gonna die, but I was so excited that he was using his words. So it's a catch-22 when they say something really rude, but you say to them, good words, don't say that. Good words, because when there's no words. So that's a really funny thing that, and you have to always look at the bright side of things, because it's not all so groovy in day-to-day life, but when they do something funny, all you can do is laugh. And we laugh a lot in my house, a lot. My 13-year-old doesn't have the language skills. So what we do is when he wants something, we don't answer until we make him talk. For example, come here and show me. Come here. Come and tell me what you want. Come sit, come here. Use your words and tell me what you want.
I want blue.
You want what? Tell me in words, what do you want? Mom?
I want President one.
Okay, we'll order it later, okay? Well, you have to let me finish, and we'll get it. Can I have a kiss first? Thank you. Okay, we'll get you a present. Let me finish with Crystal, and then we'll work on it on the computer, okay? Then? Okay, we'll get more presents for you. Okay, so that's what we do. That's pretty convenient. So we really have to ask him, I'm sorry.
Okay. So just a quick example. And I like what Vicky said, right? Would you, just in seeing those twins, would you kind of suspect something is off either by, you know, physical features or how they're acting, interacting? And how does that compare to autism spectrum disorder? Right? Would you just suspect that they had autism spectrum disorder? Or would you know there's also this underlying genetic condition? We'll come back to this second link actually when we're talking about research. And it won't advance. There we go. Okay. So I apologize about this incident report here. It was actually incorrect, and checking multiple sources, we actually saw that males have an incidence of 1 in 6,000 and females have 1 in 8,000. So I tried to Photoshop. It doesn't look great. I apologize.
You could see these features though in the one twin for sure.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. I also noticed when he like put his finger up for something, it was like very short and very like a round finger. So yeah, just some general characteristics or things that are common in those with Fragile X is the comorbid autism spectrum disorder. A lot of those same, repetitive behaviors or social skills, all of those things that we covered are almost always found in someone with Fragile X. There usually is an intellectual disability, so an IQ score of 70 or below. And as you can tell, some of those facial features. And here's someone again. I do see that long face in a lot of these guys. Some of them do have the big ears, others of them kind of make the angle is weird, but I don't necessarily see it. So kind of just in general, it's estimated that 5% of individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder also have Fragile X. And the most commonly inherited cause of intellectual disability. And also females usually have mild symptoms, again, because of where the gene is, it's on the X. So as you can see here, we're comparing, it'll be much more clear when we go into medical and behavioral and things like that, but we'll be comparing autism spectrum disorder with whatever that diagnosis is, and kind of succession. So I'm just going to cover a lot of the things in the yellow, and most of it I'll kind of just breeze over because we've already talked about it extensively. So that large, long, narrow head, abnormally large testicles in males after puberty. And with that, of course, you always want to be ruling out other medical conditions and making sure that everything is functional, everything is healthy. Typically, people with Fragile X also have a bluish discoloring of skin, kind of ashen looking. You will see a lot of toe walking, which is, again, very, very common in people with autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes it's an issue of the Achilles tendon being a little too short. Other times it's more of a tactile or sensation kind of thing again. So ruling out any medical things, if anything can be done, looking into PT, OT, things like that. Just a little bit of musculoskeletal kind of things here. Scoliosis is common in people with Fragile X, as it will be in a lot of these successive genetic disorders here. Weakness in the connective tissue, which is why they kind of have that flexibility in the joints. Let's see. That toe walking, again, that prolonged hyperarousal, right? So really having that activated state.
I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yep.
So again, you can see many of the behavioral presentations, as Kelly said, are very similar, right? You see some strong, you may see some of the stereotypy, the repetitive behaviors that we see with autism. You will see a lack of eye contact and a seeming avoidance of social interactions, but the reason for that is very different with people with Fragile X. So they're still interested in having social relationships and interacting. The avoidance tends to be related to anxiety that's being experienced versus almost an inherent part of the syndrome, as we see with autism. And again, that has some significant implications for how we would go about helping them enhance their social interactions. Wouldn't want to use more traditional types of interventions necessarily, or at least be cognizant of the fact that if the function is to escape anxious feelings or discomfort, we need to manage that differently than if it's just escaping a task. All right, so you need to just look at it a little bit differently. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the hyperarousal, and I apologize if I do it in a way that makes it more confusing. But on the next slide, it'll show that there is the same kind of hypersensitivity that you see with autism. But in addition, you will see tactile defensiveness. So particularly to human touch, to textures and things. So it's even more enhanced. So individuals who with Fragile X can be quickly agitated or made uncomfortable by environmental stimuli. And then this concept of hyperarousal, our bodies, there's a certain amount of arousal in our bodies that's necessary to be alive and to function. And that is maintained by our homeostatic system. That system does not function correctly in individuals, many individuals diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome. And so what happens is they become more easily aroused by environmental stimuli. They may be more intensely aroused by it. And that arousal can be prolonged in nature. And during that time, the person is essentially in fight or flight, right? Their body is in a hyper-aroused state. So you may see they are responding more emotionally. They're less able to calm themselves down because their body is physically aroused for a prolonged period of time. So during those moments, the best thing that we can do for that person is to reduce the amount of stimulation in the environment, reduce their exposure to any of those things. And again, I'm always thinking for you behavior analysts about escape extinction, right? So if you have an individual who is easily agitated, it also has implications, for example, for physical prompting, right? For someone who is tactily defensive, you don't want to use the prompt hierarchy the same way you might with a typical individual who has autism. But once that person is in that hyper-aroused state, they recommend against consequent interventions, right? Escape extinction. Those are things, given the environmental sensitivities, the hyperarousal that is inherent in this syndrome, that we reduce stimulation, allow them to escape that thing. Because again, adding to their anxiety and adding to their stimulation by additional consequent interventions is simply going to increase and prolong that hyperarousal even longer. So not likely to survive the extinction burst. And I don't mean that physically that they're going to die, but again, we're all coming to work to do no harm, right? And to help. So the good thing is that if there's any suspicion of Fragile X, it's just a blood test to help you determine whether an individual has that, so that you're sure that you're tailoring your treatment to the specific needs of that individual. And they look so similar behaviorally, but that's a really important one. Excuse me. And again, I mentioned already while it may look topographically the same, the social avoidance, the avoidance of eye contact, the function of it, the origin of it is very different. And again, as one might expect, right, we see generalized anxiety disorder as a prominent comorbid condition. Again, ASD, of course, the range of schizoaffective and schizotypical kinds of disorders. And I have served multiple individuals diagnosed with Fragile X, each of whom were very, very, very distinctly different from one another. Do you think we have time for Mary to take a second to describe her guy? Can you be quick, Mary? And then I'll contrast him with one of the other folks that I've served.
Yes, I can actually be very quick, just because I did have the opportunity to serve someone in that 5% who has the diagnoses of autism and Fragile X. And so in order to support him behaviorally, I was able to suggest some things that would have him to have a routine, which would minimize his anxiety, as well as give him what to expect during the day. I did notice that even my presence, when it wasn't announced or he wasn't aware that I was coming or that I would be at a certain place at a certain time, it did cause some anxiety. So again, I was able to share with others who were supporting him in various environments on how to minimize his anxiety. As far as the differences in his autism spectrum disorder condition, as well as the Fragile X, he presented more with autism than with Fragile X. It was a lot of things that are on the list and that was characterized as being a condition of Fragile X that he does not present with. He does not have sleeping issues. I can't recall, and I even inquired the last time there was an issue with him having a seizure. So it was a lot of things that someone with Fragile X would normally present with, he does not. So it was really, he's an interesting.
But as I recall, he's also quite affectionate, right? And so,
absolutely.
Right.
He seeks that out to most people that he's familiar with. We even have a special handshake just so that he can have that opportunity to engage affectionately. So yeah, he's definitely different when it comes to others who had the Fragile X diagnosis.
And then in contrast to that, I served a gentleman with Fragile X who was also in a small percentage. So we didn't go through it, but there's the one thing that is common with autism that is not as common with Fragile X is self-injurious behavior. You do not see it as frequently. This man unfortunately did engage in pretty severe, where he would punch himself in the face and caused all kinds of bruising and black eyes and things. But his environmental sensitivities and his anxiety were so severe that we had to serve him in a one-person Scylla in a duplex arrangement, because just the noise of people in a building, in a regular apartment building, caused him to engage in very severe self-injurious behavior. We could not vary routines. We'd have to prepare him for 2 weeks to get lab work or to go to the doctor. And even doing that with his most preferred and trusted staff, it was pretty typical that we would have self-injurious behavior. I served another young woman with it who hung out, worked in the community, very social, constantly walking around with her earbuds in and listening to music. Her sister, who was similarly diagnosed, spent most of the day crying. So again, it just speaks to the variability of the disorder. Tanja, hi Tanja. Tanja has raised her hand. Did you mean to? It's gone. Okay. Any questions? Why don't you move on? Okay, so Fragile X actually, I mentioned, earlier on when Kelly showed the graphic, they understand very specifically what causes Fragile X. And so unlike all the other, ASD or the other syndromes we're going to talk about, they actually talk in the research field about a cure for Fragile X. They have figured out a way. Oh my God, my cat is crawling up my back with his claws. Sorry about that. They have figured out a way to reactivate the protein on the chromosome itself. So in theory, they can cure the syndrome that is Fragile X. The problem is, how do you get that cure? Stop laughing over there, Kelly. How do you get that cure to the site, right? And so they're actually doing, and I'm a nerd, so I'll admit it, but they're actually doing some fascinating research where they're evaluating using essentially sanitized viruses to try to figure out if they can use them as a messenger to get essentially the cocktail, the cure, to the site where it needs to go. And the other wonderful thing about it is they're doing it with naturally occurring chemicals in the body. So if they can figure out how to get it there, the cure will not include adding anything foreign matter to the body. And now my mom's doctor's office is calling. So it's a good time to do the video. Perfect. I'll be back and I'm going to mute, Mary.
Okay.
I'm Jeannie. Lab has been interested in a process called X chromosome inactivation. And this process is a wonderful model by which to understand how genes are turned on and off. And because of what we've learned in the past couple of decades, we're in a position now to be able to turn back on, in a pharmacological way, genes on the X chromosome that help to treat various X-linked intellectual disabilities, including the Fragile X syndrome. I'm not a stranger to Fragile X syndrome. I started my research career in Fragile X as a PhD student back in the early 1990s. And it was in fact Fragile X that got me interested in X chromosome inactivation. And so 20 years later, we've sort of come full circle in applying our knowledge of X inactivation to treat Fragile X. We are enormously grateful to the FRAXA Foundation for providing the research support that allows us and many other laboratories to continue to make progress towards a treatment and to better understand the disease in general. Without FRAXA funding, we wouldn't have Dr. Hong-Gu Lee's work.
My name is Hong-Gu Lee, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Jinyi Lee's lab. And now I have been working about 3 years to study Fragile X syndrome. At the beginning, I wanted to study about this repetitive sequences. And repetitive sequences can trigger the silencing for some unknown mechanism. And I was interested in to understand how this silencing happens. And then when I learned about this Fragile X syndrome, which is caused by this CGG repeat, I thought this would be really interesting to study and very important to learn and study.
We can reactivate the normal FMR1 gene.
Okay.
No, that's it, Kelly. No. That's what you did want, her speaking.
Got it.
That's
I
okay.
understand. I can go back.
In patient cells by treating with this cocktail of small molecules. And it's important to realize that there's an advantage to this strategy of reactivation because it gets at the root cause of the disorder, which is the absence of FMR1 protein. And moreover, we're doing this in such a way that we do not introduce foreign genetic material into patient cells. We're utilizing a resource that is already present within patient cells to treat Fragile X. Here we're deeply committed to pursuing a treatment for Fragile X syndrome. So Fragile X has special meaning to many of us in the lab. For me personally, I began my career studying Fragile.
Okay. Snippet.
Yep. We are going to run out.
Okay.
And again, so as you'll recall, we saw 1,200 studies on autism. The slide showed there were 84 that NIH is currently tracking for Fragile X. So not nearly, but they are obviously having a great deal of success in current research. And there's tons of it out there to review if you'd like to.
Okay. So moving on to a different genetic condition entirely, one that's called tuberous sclerosis. And this is a complex genetic disorder, usually seen by the growth of benign tumors in numerous parts of the body, typically on the skin, brain, kidneys, a lot of internal organs, which can obviously lead to a lot of significant health problems, right? If you have all these tumors in your brain, something is going to go wrong. It also causes developmental problems, and signs and symptoms vary from person to person dependent upon where these tumors are. Again, they all kind of have these skin abnormalities. Usually there's a lot of light colored skin or areas of raised and thickened skin. You'll see some photos that are less appealing, FYI, around the nails, in and under the nails. And so here in the kidney, so there's a lot of kidney dysfunction. Obviously on this gentleman's face here, and all that comes with, you know, that social anxiety perhaps, what other people are thinking. Obviously then in the brain. And it can occur in any part of the brain. So dependent upon where it is, it will affect functioning. Okay, this is one that is not embedded. Let's go here and stop this lovely lady.
I can't remember exactly, but I think I first met Manny when he was just a few years old. He had actually been diagnosed as having tuberous sclerosis even before he was born because his mom knew she had it, and a prenatal ultrasound showed that Manny had cardiac tumors as a fetus. But he didn't come to the CRS clinic until he started having seizures, which was probably around age 1 or 2.
Tuberous sclerosis ranges in symptoms from mild to more severe. The more severe symptoms of tuberous sclerosis are caused by these benign tumors that appear in the patient's brain, heart, and kidney. And when they appear in the brain, they can cause the patient to have severe seizures.
Manuel has seizures called complex partial seizures. And every day he has a struggle because he doesn't understand the illness. So I have to kind of explain to him, you know, what stuff he can and can't do, because there's some limitations with the tuberous sclerosis that leads him to having struggles every day, like academics and, you know, just personal needs.
Patients with TSC can inherit tuberous sclerosis complex from their parents 1/3 of the time. And in the other 2/3, they develop this disorder just on their own, so it's new to them.
I was first diagnosed as a child myself. I had seizures, I had grand mal seizures. I had outgrew my seizures, but Manuel has seizures 2 to 3 times a day. And the neurologist is like trying to find more options because they're running out of options on medications.
But I think what we are trying to do, you know, our goal is really to discover a method of blood testing in children as soon as they're born. Not necessarily to make the diagnosis, but really to provide a way of predicting disease severity and also provide a way of, you know, treating the patients.
Okay. I find these videos to be very helpful. I hope others do as well, you know, to see it and to hear experts in the field commenting on it, I think is quite useful. I am also aware of the time, right? And we're only at tuberous sclerosis. So we're gonna kind of kick it up just a little bit and really hit on all those distinctive features. For tuberous sclerosis, 40 to 50% of people diagnosed with that meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Obviously, all the physical features we kind of talked about. In the video, they talked pretty extensively about seizures and seizure activity and managing that and getting that under control.
And I think any system can be affected if a tumor grows there, but approximately 90% of people with tuberous sclerosis do have some kind of seizure activity. But all of the other medical sections that we're looking at, it just depends.
Behavioral, Vicki, that you want to touch on?
Again, I mean, we noted, a fair number of folks meet diagnostic criteria for ASD. You see that some of those same kinds of behavioral patterns, depending upon which systems are affected by the tuberous sclerosis, right? You see the social withdrawal is noted. I can't see the co-occurring disorders, but again, it's very similar depending upon what systems are being affected, right? Most of the research, I mean, the treatment again is treat the symptoms. The research is also very much focused on the medical, because obviously, if the brain is involved, if the heart is involved, if the kidneys, the livers, we're talking about life-threatening kinds of stuff. So most of the research and treatment really is focused on managing all of the medical complexities associated with it. There really was very little that looked at behavioral stuff. Let me make sure I'm not lying. 2 studies out of 52 looked at the efficacy of early intervention with ABA. But again, that's been much more focused. There have been a few shining lights. Afinitor has now been approved to treat very specific seizures or very specific tumors in the brain and kidney, and that's seen as a research accomplishment, as well as some seizure management. But again, unfortunately, I have served a couple of people also struggling with this disorder who had some strong behavioral features, and because of their physical features, people found them frightening and intimidating in a way that they would not had they not had some of the physical features of this disorder. So, and many individuals with this disorder do not have intellectual disabilities, so they can be pretty affected by the judgment of others.
That's a good point. Just some links for you. Should we move on to Williams?
Yes. And we're going to go faster now, so we apologize. You'll have all the information you need if you want to follow any links.
And also just to point out one more time, as we go through these disorders, we're getting less and less prevalent. So Williams syndrome is rare, characterized by growth delays both before in utero and after birth, where people typically have a short stature, again, a variety of intellectual impairment and distinctive facial features. Commonly, like with Fragile X, these facial features become more pronounced with age. You'll see photos here in a moment. They also have, let's see, dental abnormalities can occur, which is interesting. And here's a quick video on that.
Hey guys, welcome to Forward. We're a new type of doctor's office that's providing preventative primary care. We've got world-class doctors.
Let's skip that.
A very small set of genes surrounding the elastin gene on chromosome 7. We have 30,000 genes in the brain. We're talking about 20 or 25 genes in one little place on one particular chromosome. And it turns out that when that is missing, when that lops off in the very, very earliest stages, it gives rise, wherever that occurs in the world, to an individual with a very unusual profile.
I don't know if people could hear her, but they've identified 28 different genes within the 7q11.23 region that could play a role in the development of Williams.
Your definition of what Williams syndrome is.
Okay.
Williams syndrome is a birth defect I was born with.
Most people with Williams syndrome love interaction, they love engagement, they love to catch your eye and get a smile, and I almost feel like that's candy for them. It's like, oh good, I caught another smile, or like someone fishing, I caught one and it felt so good.
If I ever get the chance to actually go in a real recording studio with a big bass fiddle, believe me, I'll call you so I can record with you, man.
I work at Cracker Barrel, I'm a greeter.
Ooh, I bet you're good at that.
I am. I always take people to their tables and I make everybody happy. I heard nice compliments. The bosses are very happy and I make everybody happy. I'm a happy man for the rest of my life.
Williams people are very musical. They love music, they love arts, they love dancing, so that's a very cool thing about Williams syndrome.
I think there is something special about Williams syndrome and music in a couple of ways. I mean, so many people with Williams syndrome have intense emotional responses to music, intensely happy. So I just think a lot of people with Williams syndrome feel music more emotionally.
Tell me about your love for music.
Oh, music to me is like the soundtrack of the world.
What do you say about the challenges of Williams syndrome? How would you characterize those?
Well, there are many, different challenges. When you get to see someone who has Williams syndrome, it's like a whole different world.
Now you do it, Ben, and stay on the road. Oh, you went off the road a little bit. Let's try it one more time. We're going to take it.
Students with Williams syndrome have a difficulty focusing. They are known in general to have poor focusing ability. It's compounded by an inability to filter out other students in the room who may be working on a different project, and because of their hypersensitive hearing, they can often even hear things going on in the hallway or in the classroom next door, and those all become distractions.
When you test a child with Williams syndrome, you might get an overall IQ that's in the high 50s or low 60s, but verbal abilities and nonverbal reasoning abilities potentially in the 80s. So a huge discrepancy, and it means the overall IQ is not a valid indicator of the child's abilities.
Stop there. Very, very friendly. Okay. So here are some more photos. This one I actually think I kind of see something. A narrow face, that short upturned nose, and a upturned mouth or a larger smile, small jaw.
Can you see the star pattern in any of those irises? No, I can't see it anyway.
Far away, yeah. And they touched on this in the video. A lot of the times there are some advanced language skills that kind of mask the level of intellectual impairment, right? So one of their strengths is reciprocal communication, conversation with others. Maybe they have a wide vocabulary, right? And so just speaking with them, maybe you sense something is not quite right, something's off. But a lot of the times, some of their other skills, like they said, are more in the 50s and 60s in terms of IQ. Weaknesses are visual spatial construction, hand-eye coordination, fine motor control. But because they are so social, one strength with that too is that they tend to remember and recognize faces. They do have those elfin-like features, right? They look kind of cute and little. And Vicky, like you said, they have a star-like pattern of their iris. It looks kind of like a burst within their eye. But as I was even watching the video, I was like, wow, if I just saw this person, I would think, wow, they are really friendly. And for someone with autism, I think immediately my mind would go to autism. And then from there kind of figure out exactly what it is. So even having all this information right in front of me, it's so interesting and distinctive. With Williams syndrome, that being said, clinical exam is needed for diagnosis along with blood tests. In terms of their body and physical presentation, you will see premature graying of the hair, typically early development of secondary sexual characteristics as well. And they do have hyperacuity to sounds, right? They said that they can hear very, very well. And so typical speaking voice can almost be painful to them, right? Which is so interesting because with autism, if a speaking voice is painful, they'll kind of just, retreat. Whereas here, they really want to engage in that conversation. And so that can be pretty conflictual. Also issues here with the kidney and bladder. Sometimes an awkward gait. You saw that with
The little boy.
that little boy who was kind of co-walking, and then there was something going on where his knees were kind of knobby and kind of walking with an open gait.
I want to make one little note on the medical, because I know you cut us a little short to try to move things along. It is very common for people to have a vast number of cardiac issues, stenosis and some of those things. So if there is involvement, heart issues and things, again, worth figuring out whether an individual may be suffering from it. And actually, in some of the research literature, there's been sort of a resurgence in research on Williams, and they are attributing it to the cardiac involvement, that the larger community is interested in it, not just parents and loved ones of someone with it, because of the potential to learn about stenosis and other cardiac conditions. So a positive thing coming out of a sad symptom. Behaviorally, this is one where you do not often see SIB or physical aggression. Do see ADD and ADHD like many of the other conditions we're going to talk about. They identify very specifically that individuals with Williams may really struggle with switching focus more than they do. It may take a minute to get them focused, but then switching focus can be very challenging for them. Whereas most of the other conditions, it was they struggle to get focused at all, right? And then it's an ongoing challenge. Once these individuals get focused, it can be difficult to get them unstuck a little bit. And Kelly mentioned the unusual interest in faces, being very, very social, very smiley. That can put individuals with Williams at more significant risk for exploitation than others. Some of the advocacy literature talks about friends at the expense of everything else, that they just are so desperately seeking out that social interaction that they may be more at risk for negative consequences. And again, that hyperacusis that Kelly talked about in terms of that normal sounds may in fact be painful and be distressing to them in ways that they are not to others. Again, I'm speaking to some of the behavioral people, right? Keeping that in mind, right? If they are attempting to escape, it could be because it is physically painful to them. So you may want to consider alternatives to escape extinction for folks who struggle with that. They also noted the musicality in the video. And I just wanted to make sure and clarify, they don't mean that it's like the idiot savant, phenomenon that is talked about elsewhere. It is not that individuals with Williams tend to be more musical or more talented musically, but they tend to be drawn to music and respond more emotionally and positively to music than other individuals. And that has resulted in not the government funded research, but a separate line of research being funded by the advocacy groups to really look at the impact of using music therapy in a much more concentrated way with folks with this condition than it's researched and I didn't see it being used in any of the research literature with any of the other conditions. Okay, let me see what else, if there's anything else. Oh, if you move on to the co-occurring, and because of, you see the same kind of anxiety kind of stuff, but there are very specific phobias that again seem to be associated with some of their hypersensitivities. So they will have specific phobias to certain sounds, like an alarm sound or a drill sound, but way beyond a strong emotional response. It is in fact a diagnosed phobia. High places, weird visual things. So that is the only disorder that identified specific phobias as common. And again, IQ, anywhere from normal to severe. In terms of treatment, again, no cure, treat the symptoms, generally PTOT, right? ABA and medication. Desensitization, but again, caution, as we should always be being sensitive, right? Making sure that individuals have the coping skills in their repertoire prior to the initiation of any kind of exposure therapy, especially when anxiety is a common comorbid condition. Again, when we look at the research, we're down to 20 studies from 1,200 with autism. But as I said, there's a little resurgence more recently, and again, related to the cardiac issues. We're actually doing some, I guess I must have taken it out of this version. They had been running some studies, they were discontinued and then reinitiated because of the more recent interest. I don't know if they're doing it for Williams or if I took it out, but for a few of these less prevalent, they are doing what they call, oh my gosh, what is it? Field histories. Now it's not coming to me. I'll have to find the right phrase, but where they are, have found a great number of individuals diagnosed with a disorder who are willing to be followed through their lifetime. Because again, they really don't understand the disorders well. So that's allowing them to really try to understand it from birth to death. And again, for the lesser known, lesser well-funded.
Is there any research regarding their life expectancy?
None that I came across, Mary. Most of it was medication related. With regard to that, like the government funded, it was almost all medication related. A few studies with ABA and cognitive stuff. By the way, you'll see the phrase a lot in what I provided you, but also in the research, and they talk about translational. All that means is that they are evaluating the efficacy of existing drugs with individuals diagnosed with a certain condition. So they're not just, you'll see in some of the more prominently investigated disorders that they're looking at the development of new drugs. In the lesser known disorders, they're typically doing translational research. So taking Risperdal, which is, FDA approved for autism, to see how it might work. Oh, somebody's got a frozen screen. Are we all frozen, Lois?
I can hear and see you, you're moving.
Okay, other people are saying no. But Mary, I did not see anything specifically about the life expectancy. I'm going to have to go back and research that. Okay.
And then just links for you for Williams.
Now, again, we're approaching another hour. It's up to you, ladies, if you want to take a break now for 10 minutes or continue.
We take a random poll. Can 10 people say break or no break? And we'll go with the. Okay. Okay, more.
A lot of no breaks.
So we're just going to keep plowing along. Okay.
Right.
But we'll try to end early. Okay, go, Kelly.
Okay. So Cornelia is next. This genetic syndrome is characterized by slow growth again before and after birth, leading to short stature, intellectual disability that's usually more moderate to severe. Here you see a lot of abnormalities in the bones of the arms, hands, and fingers. Also have distinctive facial features that you'll see. And obviously why we're doing this and comparing is because they also have a lot of issues similar to someone with autism spectrum disorder. Where did it go? Must not have clicked.
I think I had certain time parameters on this one, Kelly.
Yeah.
That were abbreviated. You want to start at 10
Your
minutes.
visitor came round and
15
just said,
seconds.
"No, your child's retarded."
He just said to me, "Your child is mentally handicapped. She's deformed in her face, and visually."
Shattered. It really was just
Kelly,
an
did you hear me?
awful time.
It's not.
I
mean,
have
in terms, go
just
to
the
10
beginning
minutes,
and then up, but
10 minutes, 15.
Yep.
Just to give us an idea of the behavioral presentation.
Many have autistic tendencies.
Physical characteristics.
In terms of social behaviour, we see enormous variability. This is primarily related to whether children fall within the autistic spectrum. If they do, then we will see impaired sociability. On the other hand, it's very clear that we do see children and adults with Cornelia de Lange syndrome who develop friendships and relationships in the same way that any other children and adult may do so.
We had some issues with her in those early stages. She would try to do things with other kids by using touch, for example, and she would reach out to touch somebody's face, and of course there's panic involved, and then there's panic involved, you move a lot faster. So we had problems with some other kids at the time.
The only strain I think we could ever say is emotional, where, she gets upset because she hasn't got so many friends as other people. Every job that she'd ever been to, at first she was very, needed my support mentally, really, that was all.
Most people love her because she has got a smashing sort of temperament. There's no nastiness in it. I mean, her brothers and sisters will take toys off Bethany and she doesn't get affected by it, like where, as if it happened the other way around, they would. She just sort of lets them get on with it and she'll go and play with something else. She's very, very nice from that point of view,
They don't like change. They don't like change. But once they're in change, I find with Tracy anyway, once the change has happened, it's adapted so quick like that it was like there was nothing.
She likes things to be ordered and to do at 3 o'clock in the afternoon what she did at 3 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday and the day before that. So she has a number of routines that she goes through. If we do buy anything new, it stays in a wardrobe for about 6 months while she gets used to the idea of it being in there, and then suddenly one day she'll wear it. Once she starts wearing it, it's very difficult to get her to stop wearing it. It will be, every other time. As soon as it's washed, it's back on again.
CDLS children tend to have a high pain threshold, and self-injurious behaviour is not uncommon. A lot of the self-injury that we see in Cornelia de Lange syndrome is directed towards the hands and the fingers, biting and picking. Now, when we've tested children and we measure the speed of nerve impulses in their arms, around 80% of children show very slow nerve impulses. And this may mean that they're not experiencing pain in their hands and arms in the same way that other people do.
Because it comes out of nowhere. She'll be happily playing and she'll suddenly start to bite herself. She does bite herself and she kicks her feet and kicks the skin off her feet. But I think it's because she's in pain all the time.
We've always been able to use distraction with Thomas. If we see him biting, we distract him with a toy or distract him by talking to him. If he starts to bang his head, we just...
Okay. So here you saw this with a lot of the individuals in the video, but those distinctive facial features, right? Where kind of the brows are connected, the upturned nasal tip, a very short nose, a concave nasal bridge. Some webbing here in between the toes. And here's of the upper extremities. This one is equal across genders. Here again in yellow, involuntary eye movement. Sometimes there's some nystagmus, right? So where the eye is moving uncontrollably, right? They're not intentionally moving their eye, but it's going back and forth and back and forth. And I just can't imagine living like that, right? Like I just move my eyes back and forth now and it almost gives me a headache. I can't focus on anything, and that's really frustrating and agitating. As you saw in that one photo, the joining and kind of webbing of the second and third toes that you can see, maybe missing fingers, hands, arms, are typically underdeveloped. And again, we're kind of just sharing all of these things, you know, so if one person is like, oh, so-and-so has this second and third toe where they're kind of connected, right? Maybe something just to explore, not to say, oh my gosh, they have this, right? But just to make sure that we're not missing anything when we're supporting and treating. This one has underdevelopment of genitals, which is a little bit opposite of a few of the others. This one has abnormal placement of urinary opening. Let's see, a lot of intestinal twists, hernias, a lot of GI distress.
A lot of GI.
A lot of things being underdeveloped in utero. Malformation of hands and arms, we saw forceful vomiting, likely due to that GI distress, discomfort, and abnormalities.
When it comes to their behavioral presentation, Kelly, you're
sorry, it's gone. It's back.
Okay. No, again, I mean, there we go. Okay, so you can see, as we talked about at the very beginning, right? Communication may or may not be an issue. Cornelia DeLange, they do not identify physical aggression, but do the other sort of typical things we might see with an individual with autism, ADHD, SIB, as they mentioned specifically to the hands. Now you can move over, Kelly. I couldn't find a video that had it, but they describe a low, almost growling noise that individuals may make. So I don't know how to alert you to that one, but if a person has unusual vocalizations that might resemble a growl. And I think the decreased facial expression you could kind of see in, it's almost a flat affect look in the face, and then regurgitation as distinguishing behavioral characteristics for them. Not particularly sensitive. So each of these other ones that we've talked about, right? We've talked about a variety of environmental sensitivities. That is not the case. You can go to the next screen. And as far as the comorbid conditions, again, along the same lines as the others, you can see as we're building the table across, right? How many of these disorders co-occur with one another, hence the difficult diagnostic picture. Treatment is again the standard one, right? There is no known cure, so treat the symptoms, PTOT. Again, the emphasis is on monitoring that GI and that cardiac, right? Because of the complications. The advocacy group did not have particularly strong recommendations like some of the other ones did. But again, since there is such a small prevalence, the research and the treatment options that are out there are not well understood. So if you move to the research, you can see a total of 4 studies on NIH, right? And they even had to stop one of them because they ran out of participants. So looking at meds, and then just that basic understanding of the disorder itself, right? Nothing startling that's come out of the research. So.
Okay, still pressing on, huh? Let's do it. Next is Angelman's. It's again a genetic disorder that primarily affects the nervous system. Obviously, developmental delays, intellectual disability, speech impairments, problems with movement and balance. A lot of people also have seizures, as we saw in the tuberous sclerosis, microcephaly here. And with this one, you can kind of identify that there's some developmental delays, things going on between the ages of 6 to 12 months.
I love my sibling because he always comes to hug you and smiles a lot. Sometimes it's a bit annoying when he hugs me because he might dribble on you or something like that.
Likes to chew his clothes a lot.
Likes playing with water. He will splash you a lot.
They tend to love their food, looking at pictures. They love reflective surfaces.
I would describe her as a toddler with 8 years worth of experience of life.
They are very inquisitive. They like to touch things and work out how things work.
The focus of attention will just flit back and forward between things.
It's very complex. I think he's got a full personality. It's not just the laugh or the smile. He has strong emotions. He's growing up.
It's really hard to tell what's Ewan and what's Angelman syndrome because the two are so interlinked.
We have to give him like a sleeping potion, so then he would go to bed easier.
So management of sleep is complex and often families need some help with that. Many children just simply don't need as much sleep.
Sometimes he wakes up at about 3 in the morning. That happens at least once a week.
He's very hyper.
I know children with Angelman syndrome who run. They don't just walk, they run.
She gets around very well on her own by crawling, by holding onto a handrail, but mostly by holding onto the hand of a supporter.
Sports day for us is something that it's a day that Jack absolutely loves. He runs virtually every race, whether he's supposed to be in it or not. And once he decides that he doesn't want to do something, he just gets on the floor and lies there, and you can't get him to stand up, whatever you try and do.
Supermarket trips in general are very entertaining, where he can reach both sides of the aisles. He'll happily empty the shelves, empty everybody's basket as he's walking around.
He might nick someone's thing from their bag and then try and either eat it or throw it on the floor or chew it or something.
If she wants attention, sometimes she'll bite, but not very often.
You put a piece of paper down, she ripped it. You put your best china out, she'd break it.
Families would describe Angelman individuals as pretty stubborn or determined.
Lots of children display behaviours that could be considered challenging, and that can include things like physical aggression, biting, pulling hair, and this is obviously really distressing for the families.
We find that if we create a lot of activities and always make sure that he's entertained, we don't get challenging behaviour. It's really a sign of boredom and frustration.
Find the right things for them to enjoy, and he will sit nicely.
And even if he can't get out of his bucket and run around and play with the other children, he really likes to be included and he really likes watching them play.
She loves the dog's fur, just likes to yank the tail, but the dog and her are best mates.
And he reaches out and grabs
people either with his smile or with his arms, and gives the best hugs.
So some good examples there.
To me, that one looks the most like autism.
I agree. So some facial features that you might have also seen in some of the individuals in the video. What stands out most to me is those the teeth, the way that they're spaced so evenly and equally, with a very large smile. They also commonly have seizures associated with intellectual disability. But yeah, I agree, Vicki. This is the one. I mean, if I just saw them walking by, I would say, oh, that is most likely someone with autism spectrum disorder. So this 50 to 80% show symptoms of autism spectrum, but social behavior is not typically similar to that of autism spectrum.
They seek that interaction, as you saw.
Correct. Yep. Sleep does improve with age, but they have a really decreased need for sleep, a lot of hyperactivity. Again, here we see this involuntary eye movement. I keep doing this for nystagmus, but it can also be up and down or around and round, which also, oddly enough, is linked with issues with sleep disorders, right? So a lot of the times when we're sleeping and dreaming and we fall into that REM state, that's when our eyes move back and forth, and they're maybe potentially already kind of doing that. So it could potentially be linked as a reason why they have these sleep disturbances. Again, that big wide mouth, sometimes with the protruding tongue. Exaggerated reflexes is something that's quite different here. So something neurological going on. We saw this in a few of the guys, right? So that one guy who was like chasing after it kind of looked like he had a little too much fun partying one night. But that does carry over into speech as well, right? A lot of this, the lower muscle tone, the ataxia, slurring of speech, sensitivity to heat here is also something that's distinct of this disorder.
Again, behaviorally very similar with the exception of physical aggression. I think it's less severe.
I'm so sorry. I keep thinking you're done.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Go ahead. There's the hyperactivity. You saw the feature where the kids were laying there kind of staring through water and all that kind of stuff. There's this real attraction to it, which again mimics, but it's very, very specific to shiny objects, that kind of thing, versus the wheel on the truck kind of thing that you might see with autism. The distinguishing behavioral characteristic that they talk about with this is that individuals will have these like bouts of giggling and laughing and all that kind of stuff, but they will be incongruent to the situation. And so it makes people wonder, and that's why lower on you'll see there's a question mark with people wonder if there might be some rapid cycling bipolar disorder, a different kind of, most of these were related to ADHD, anxiety on the affective continuum in a different way. But with this one, because it almost has, psychotic is not the right word, but a thought disorder feel to it when you observe it, right? That they are not responding to the world around them. They're having these kind of giggling, laughing fits that are unrelated to what's happening around them. This was one of the only disorders that really identified irritability too. So typically there is an intellectual disability, right? But you can see the comorbid conditions were just ADHD. Really very little different in terms of recommendations. Speech, physical, medical, right? Treat the symptoms, no known cure again. However, we didn't talk about what the Angelman's is actually related to a specific issue on chromosome 15 that the mother's gene is expressed, but the paternal gene is silenced. And just at the end of last year, last October, they were able to reduce the severity of symptoms of Angelman by turning on the paternal silent gene in mice. So obviously there's a pretty big stretch from mice to humans, but that was a pretty exciting development in the research. And again, if they can figure out how to get it to the site, there is the potential of maybe a cure, right? At least they're farther along than all the rest of them except Fragile X. So, but nothing too extraordinary about treatment. The focus really is mostly still understanding it, as you can see, right? A total of 26. About half are just general issues related to it. They're looking at meds, obviously, to address those critical sleep issues because that affects everything in the world, right? And interestingly enough, they're actually evaluating carbidopa, levodopa is what they give people with Parkinson's to control both tremors, but also issues with balance, issues with gait. So while I think they're doing it to address the tremors, there may be some benefit for the ataxia also that is often observed with folks with Angelman. So, and there's the name, a natural history study that I couldn't come up with before. That's where they're following people through their lifetimes to make sure that they understand. So there you go.
Our last one.
Yes.
Okay. This last one is Smith-Magenis syndrome. It affects varying parts of the body. However, the main features of this condition include mild to moderate ID, delayed speech and language, distinctive facial features, sleep disturbances again here, but that's different than Angelman that we just discussed. And we'll talk about how they're different in just a moment. And then obviously relating behavioral issues. It's kind of thought that the loss of the RAI1 in this case is responsible for most of the features of the condition. So they've kind of narrowed that and targeted that specific thing. So as you'll see, research and treatment are kind of being projected using that. A lot of the cases, the deletion is not inherited, instead occurring randomly during the formation of eggs or sperm or while in utero. This one is diagnosed using a blood test or a cytogenic test. A lot of the time they can do microarray analysis to figure this one out.
Very special day for me. It's SMS Awareness Day, also known as Smith-Magenis syndrome. Now, many of you may know my older sister Brianna has SMS, and she is a lot of the reason why I moved back to Central New York. Now, I think she is very special, and I want you to see just how special she is. And I also want you to learn a little more about her and how underdiagnosed her disorder is. Happy, affectionate, excited, and my heart will go on. Loud are some good words to describe my sister Brianna. She's 29 years old and has Smith-Magenis syndrome. She was diagnosed at age 11. SMS is a chromosomal disorder. It's a deletion of chromosome 17. According to prisms.org, SMS occurs in 1 out of every 15 to 25,000 births. It's usually confirmed through a clinical blood test. Some of the symptoms you might see in people who have the disorder are repetitive self-hugging, difficulty paying attention, and get this, flipping pages in books, which is one of her favorite things to do. Now, each individual has an obsession. Some like washing machines or computers, but Bree happens to like phones. She will ask you every question in the world about your phone. She also asks, "Is that new?" or "Not here." Once we learned she had SMS, we started going to conferences to see how we could give her the best care. We are learning new things every single day, and it's a lot of work, but we wouldn't trade her for anything. The endless hugs, which are amazing, the constant phone calls, and the "I miss you, sissy" comments are something I will always have.
I missed you so much. I want you to come back home. What else? And I love you.
I know for a fact I'll always be loved. She's way more than just a sister. She's my best friend and someone who taught me the importance of being patient, empathetic, and loving. I cannot thank her enough for helping me become the woman I am today.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So this one, I can't lie, I don't really see a whole lot in this particular one. Maybe I'm missing something. Let's see. So the mid face, they say, is flattened, especially at the bridge of the nose. I do see that in this, gosh, I'm going to point to the screen to show you. In this example where she's little here, I some of that. The prominent rosy cheeks, a pushed up lip, and a prominent jaw.
I don't see it.
We look over here, kind of that webbing. Yeah, and they're even showing some upper extremities of the hands. Okay. So initially, people are often diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, right? A lot of those same features, behaviorally, cognitively, socially, all of those things. Although they are particularly affectionate. I meant socially in terms of like language skills and language acquisition and communication. The strength here, which is really fascinating, they have a great long-term memory and perceptual awareness. Weakness, they have short-term memory and sequential processing issues. So that's very interesting that it gets encoded somehow, right? And they're able to remember long-term things, but the short-term is not so much. That's so fascinating to me. Eyes can appear bulging here. Persistent fetal finger pads, no fingerprints is sometimes common. So they commit lots of crimes and get away with it. God, I'm so hilarious today. But I think that's really interesting that never develops again. The webbed toes may have extra fingers or toes here, an inward curvature of their pinky.
Dry skin can be a real issue because it then combines with some of the type of self-injurious behavior they have. So people will, what starts with dry skin will become a wound that they will continue to pick at so much that they reopen and open and open. And
yes, and yeah, I thank you for saying that because we did see a photo of that. Yeah. So issues with sleep here, whereas we saw before with Angelman, they kind of have a decreased need for sleep, especially when they're younger. Here they have a circadian rhythm disturbance in approximately 90% of people. And so sometimes the circadian rhythm, kind of that timekeeper, if you will, to let you know, gosh, I'm getting tired, it's time for bed, will oftentimes be flipped. And so,
literally flipped.
Yeah.
So melatonin is its highest rates during the day. So their body is saying sleep during the day and be awake at night.
Obviously, functionally, that can cause an issue, right? For the person, for the family. And yeah, it can be quite a disturbance. Nothing really of note here. A broad gait is sometimes noted here, which we've seen a lot of issues with gait and a lot of these genetic disorders. Dental issues I had mentioned before, decreased pain and temperature sensitivity, which can of course be alarming, right? If you want to have some sort of sensitivity and sensation, you know, if you're going to be hurt or burned. But like what Vicky was saying with like the picking at a wound or something like that, they oftentimes don't feel it as someone else would, right? And so they just keep going, causing and prolonging damage.
Okay. The significant behavioral characteristics of Smith-Magenis are with to the self-injurious. So this is one of the few disorders where insertion of objects was identified very specifically, but there also is a tendency to literally rip out fingernails and toenails. So if you're working with someone who tends to do that, and again, the skin picking can become very, very serious, especially if you imagine, like I worked with a guy for a while where his feet would get dry. He would then start picking. He would then open a wound on the bottom of his foot and would continue to do so and then go barefoot or be wearing shoes and his feet are sweating. So he would end up with chronic infections and issues related to, you know, I don't usually think of skin picking as a particularly serious form of self-injury, but in this, with this disorder, it can be very serious. And I cannot impress enough the impact of the flip circadian rhythm. Like literally you end up with, because there can also be like we might see with some of the other conditions, an infatuation with certain events or objects. And it doesn't matter what time of day or night it is, right? If you're wide awake at night, I mean, I served a gentleman who was preoccupied with letters from Santa. And so he would run out at all times of the night trying to check the mail for Santa because he was wide awake. His parents both worked. It was very, very challenging for the entire family. And then it was very challenging during the day because his body was exhausted, telling him to sleep. Again, you behavior analysts, make sure you understand the MOs because no amount of behavioral intervention was going to make this kid stay awake. There was a period of time, which I don't think I showed in the research section here. They've done all kinds of research on melatonin, trying to address the sleep disturbances because of the vast impact it has on the person and everyone around him. For about 10 years, there was a line of research where they combined beta blockers with melatonin. And several studies actually said they were able to reverse and right the circadian rhythm with that combination of medicine. But then the research just disappeared. After about 2015, I could not find any more research on it. I know most recently, the gentleman that I was working with had some respiratory complications, which are not uncommon. And so because of the impact of the combination of meds, there may be some real precautions because of the medical issues related to Smith-Magenis. But it was sad that they figured out a solution to it. And now, for whatever reason, it was eliminated as a treatment option. You saw in the video a couple of the unique behavioral features. You saw the little girl go like this, and that's referring to the self-hugging. And you'll see that when the person's really excited, they might do this, and then they might hug themselves. So again, kind of a unique behavioral pattern. And then the lick and flick is literally that, right? Almost like you used to see the secretary at, you know, with that little, what was it, rubber thing on their finger? Like you'll see that with magazines, you'll see it with, there might be a preoccupation with sales ads. that kind of paper, because you can easily kind of move it with a damp finger. So again, just those are some odd and unique behavioral features. So I can't see the hypersensitivity, but I know that there's a tactile defensiveness, right? As well as environmental sensitivities, but as I recall, they're pretty varied within Smith-Magenis. So you wouldn't necessarily say sound or light or crowds. Not unlike the others now when you're looking at the table, right? Anxiety, OCD, right? Autism, bipolar. The unique one is the tic disorders, right? But again, only exhibited typically in children. So there's a very active treatment community. I'm sorry, I forgot the ID, right? There is typically some involvement, some intellectual disability of some sort. No cure, again, treat the symptoms. Interestingly enough, the advocacy groups with regard to Smith-Magenis argue against consequent interventions and the use of only antecedent interventions, using distraction, redirection versus consequent things. And I've only worked with a couple of people with Smith-Magenis, so my information is only anecdotal, but I did find that the parental attempts to try to use, get them to earn things, or, you're only going to get the 7th Christmas tree up in the house if you do X or Y. It threw him into, he became frozen, and it would be no matter what was asked of him. I actually took data on it, and depending upon the circumstances under which they did it, sometimes he would refuse completely. Other times, whatever he was going through and had to work through in that moment, if they gave him time and then came back, like the 2nd or 3rd time, usually he might agree to do it. But when they got themselves in that cycle, it didn't matter if it was the thing he desperately wanted to do. They got into this power struggle. Mom would say, well, it's all about control, but it didn't appear to be. It appeared that it triggered something, and he would have to work through it. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, and then he could figure it out. Very strong advocacy prisms and a very strong research base. And as far as the research, I'm sorry, there's not a lot of it. As you can see, much of it, understandably, is really focused on trying to understand the sleep disturbance stuff. There is a strong tendency toward obesity also. And again, I didn't necessarily find anything that convinced me. Is it because people are up wandering around the house in the middle of the night when no one else is awake? So you got nothing else to do with sleep? I have no idea. I mean, there was nothing that necessarily identified why the obesity was occurring. But it's a very, very active research community, but they are focused on that, which is most critical, right, for the person and the people who love them. So hopefully they will expand to some other areas.
We've also included some general links as well. After each genetic disorder, we included links specific to that disorder, and then these are more broad.
And I will say the government has tons and tons of information out there. Unfortunately, much of it is under multiple different departments. And so it's not always easy to find one storing house for all the information. You do have to go around to several different departments, but there's a ton of excellent information out there. So we're done, I think.
For
any questions?
Listening and putting up with us through all the cat clawings and the children crying. Does anybody have any questions?
I do know that the training department, they're not on with us because they had other commitments, but I do know that they are asking that people at this point give them a couple of weeks to get out your CEs. But we will make sure that Anna has both the Excel document that for everyone, and then the PowerPoint to go out to everybody. If you want anything more specific, should we just say email me, Kelly? Because I have
Sure, that works, and then you can direct from there.
Go ahead and email me and Vicky, and we'll be happy to provide you with everything that we have. So thank you all very much.
Mary, was there anything of note?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, was there anything we needed to?
Actually, no. Everyone's saying great presentation. Thank you for the information. I am going to provide the email addresses again. I did it earlier on in the presentation. I'm just rechecking your spelling of your last name, Vicki.
Yeah. Well, that's smart of you, Mary, because it's easy to.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, it looks as though people have stopped. Wish we could have seen your faces, but nonetheless, thank you, ladies. I think it went fine. So I'm going to shut us down.
Bye.